We are back, and today we are going to speak about relational capacities. How do we get mindful about our way of being in relationships, in everyday conversations? The relational wheel is something we came up with to help people orient to 6 relational capacities. These are the capacities by which we orient to the activity of relating. And in the process of relating, we create our sense of self and the sense of the other and the world around us.
In the moment-by-moment back and forth of relating, we either create a relational space that is productive and generative and creates belonging, or we shut all that down. Relating is the words, the tone, the context and history between people, gestures, the expressions. All of these things make up relating.
Relating is always present. It can be in text messages and it can be in our spoken word. It can be in our looks, it can be in our gestures. Relational intelligence is the art of relating. It's a socio-relational orientation where we are noticing how in relationships we create the social world and how the social world acts on us, on the relationship as we engage with each other. In an organizational context, relational intelligence is orienting to the network of conversations and relationships as capacities, as resources, as things that we are building with each other.
We know and understand that more equitable, diverse, and inclusive organizations have dramatically higher levels of innovation, productivity, better business outcomes, employee retention, all the things that we're seeking in a successful workplace. What we do when we lean into relationships in the workplace is we seek to flatten hierarchy and create a more generative, collaborative context in which business is done. So the question becomes, where are the challenges when we try to move into a flatter, more relational workplace? Well, it comes down to conversations. So imagine you and anyone that you're in a conversation with are co-creating what we call a relational space, a shared space between you and them in which each of you are contributing to what gets created next.
Stay Playful is a way of inviting others to co-create, to co-design with us. It's a way of relating with another where we don't come in with a fixed assumption about what needs to happen, but we come in with an invitation to co-create and co-design. So when we're staying playful, we bring our ideas, but we bring it with a lightness. We bring it with an offer to build with the other and not to block other ideas. How we adapted and how we responded to COVID and recreated our workplaces is play. All organizations had to adapt, had to pivot. There was trial and error, there was experimentation, people made offers, people came back after they tested and recreated new possibilities. All of those are examples of play at workplace. When we feel pressure, we tend to close down. But in play, we can stay wide open, thus inviting many more possibilities and creativity that leads to both innovation and also a sense of belonging. Listening with curiosity, from an improvisational perspective, is a build, don't block. To not only listen with our ears, but to be open-hearted listening, to look for context. Listening with curiosity is to create context.
What we say to ourselves before we engage in any conversation is, I intend to be surprised by what I hear, and I intend to learn something new. And when we take that intention into a conversation, we're doing something very specific. For most of us, especially if we've been working with someone for a number of years, we might have put together a story about that individual, a set of expectations about how they're going to respond or what questions they're going to ask us back. We create a predictive narrative of how we think that conversation is going to go. So if I instead go in expecting to be surprised and to learn something new, the following thing happens. Most conversations have multiple threads. Let's say that one of the threads is that predictive narrative, that set of ideas about how we think that conversation is going to go. So I go in and I sit down with Frank and I begin speaking with Frank and we're exchanging back and forth. And I'm listening for the ideas that are on that predictive narrative thread. And so if Frank says something a little unexpected or offers an idea that's not part of that, I might have a tendency to ignore those things and keep listening for those aspects of the conversation that confirm the prediction I have about how Frank is going to respond. But if I do something different, if I expect to be surprised and expect to learn something new, I'll pay attention to those other threads. Think of them as new growth, green shoots, little ideas that aren't as strong as some of the other ones that we have in our history. But I might choose instead to say, hey, Frank, tell me more about that over there. You had a new idea about how to handle the budgeting for the project. Or, Frank, this is really an interesting question because it raises this for me. New, different ideas begin to emerge in that conversation. Out of that comes a wider range of possibilities about how to go forward. But in that process, what I'm also doing is something that's also on our relational wheel, which is reframing stories. I am reframing my story about Frank by listening for those aspects of what he's offering that don't align with my predictive story about him. I'm shifting that story. I may start to say to myself, Frank thinks in really innovative ways, or I need to lean more on Frank for some of his creative thinking. And in that moment, we've reframed the story about Frank. That then becomes a predictive narrative for us, and we begin to look for innovation in the conversations with him. This validates Frank and me at the same time, because what happens is each of us begins to hear each other in more validating ways. We're no longer listening back and forth for predictive stories about each other that shut down our creativity or our newer ideas.
Here's the thing with stories. We live the stories we tell. And so stories by their nature can also be limiters. And part of reframing a story is to be open to what new stories are emerging. How does the world see us? How does the local community see us as an organization? What are the newcomers into our organization talking about as the organization? How do we reframe? How do we invite people to renew their frames or revise their frames about who we are as an organization? And all of that is happening in the network of conversation and relationships. So stories inherently are the vehicles by which the culture of our organization travels.
Next up, I want to talk about consider context, which dovetails nicely with all the other capacities on the wheel, including listening with curiosity and reframing our stories. Let's say I'm in a conversation with Frank, and his energy is down, and he seems to be blocking a little bit. Well, I can default back to my story about Frank, that he has issues with me or that we don't get along that well. Or what I can do is consider context. That is, what other possible influences are affecting the conversation I'm in. I might say to Frank, your energy seems a little down today. Is everything okay? Now, in a relationally intelligent culture, Frank would take that as a friendly inquiry, and he might share, oh yeah, well, we've got some things going on at home. We had this huge plumbing problem over the weekend, and I'm still waiting to hear from the plumber about what it's going to cost me. I then understand that Frank's energy isn't about me, it isn't about the project, it isn't about any of the narratives I might be carrying about him. We humanize the conversation, bring in the larger context.
Most often when people think about context, people think about it as the current situation. But here's the thing. Context is situational, relational, historical, cultural, and social. So context offers us rich possibilities if we can expand out beyond the situational. The question that may come up is, so how do I engage context? You engage context by getting curious and asking questions. Here are 3 touchstones about asking questions. Ask questions that orient you towards the relationship before the task at hand. And one way to do that is ask permission. Hey Sally, can I build on that idea of yours? Can I add something to it? May I ask you a question about what you just said? These are all permission-seeking questions and builder questions. They're also context-setting questions as to what's coming next. Second, to be generative, you want to ask questions that not only build on each other, but also create some shared understanding of where people are coming from. Because language can trip us. If someone says, oh, let's go with a blue logo. And what we do is when somebody suggests something in language, we complete the thought. We bring our own meaning. And what questions do is it furthers a conversation to create a shared understanding of what do we mean by blue? What's the spirit we want to bring with blue, for example? The third is ask questions from within the conversation. And what I mean by that is don't use questions to trip people or to critique them or to make them look bad. Ask questions to make them look good, to grow their idea. When you are brainstorming or designing or co-creating, and you've created a climate where ideas are welcome, then that's what they are. They are ideas. They have to be formulated, they have to be grown, they have to be nurtured. So ask questions to grow the capacity to collectively think together.
Asking questions is a really powerful resource. And asking questions not only allows us to find out about an individual's context in the moment, but it also offers us a way into conversations when we may be feeling deeply uncertain about the person we're speaking to, either because they're from a completely different part of the world, maybe they're from a different religious background. All of these things can leave us feeling uncertain and honestly fearful that we don't want to mess up the conversation, don't want to make a mistake. Remember, when you're asking questions, one of the great first questions to ask is, may I ask you about this? Questions are how we care for each other. Questions are how we care for an organization.
Our culture doesn't prepare us for not knowing or for uncertainty. In fact, it trains us to avoid uncertainty. But here's the thing. If you want to be an adaptive, responsive organization, we're already leaning into uncertainty. So the question then becomes, how do we engage uncertainty? How do we hold uncertainty as a creative resource, as a generative resource, right? And one of the best ways to do that is to play. Paradoxically, to engage uncertainty is to lean into it and not lean into control. Uncertainty is a way of being in process that we don't know what's going to emerge. But by orienting to emergence, orienting to newness, orienting to the relationships and the conversations, we start engaging a collective process that it's not my uncertainty that I'm holding. Together, we are holding each other in a process of uncertainty. So uncertainty becomes a social process by which we co-create rather than an individual emotional process. It's a process by which we are creating possibilities, creating shared understanding, creating a culture of shared inquiry, which helps us become a resilient team, helps us orient towards disruption, and as they do in the jazz improv, we can count on each other to step in and pick up the beat. And that's what relationality is, to step in and pick up the beat.